If you mark in your Bibles, underline that.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the If You Mark in Your Bible podcast. My name is Josh, your host, and today we're looking at Daniel chapter 6, verses 16 through 23, answering the question, has your God been able to deliver you? Looking at this with us and participating in our study today is Keno Shrum. Keno is an elder and the preacher at the Coweta Church of Christ in Coweta, Oklahoma. He's also a regional trainer for the house-to-house, heart-to-heart evangelism program or work that they're doing there with Rob Whitaker. Keno, thank you so much for coming on. How are you doing today?
Good. Appreciate you having me on this morning.
Good. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the house-to-house, heart-to-heart evangelism program that
So the house-to-house, heart-to-heart School of Evangelism, what we do is we train the saved to teach the lost. So our goal is to go out to congregations throughout the United States and to teach them, give them the tools that they need to be able to grow their congregations, the things that, give them a plan to get from point A to point Z and be able to effectively grow their congregations.
That's great. That's great work. I highly recommend it. I'll put the website or the link to all that in the notes below. I've been through that. School of Evangelism slipped my mind. I knew that. I've been through it twice. One while I was in preaching school, the other at the congregation I was at before South Haven. And one thing that came from that congregation was people who I wouldn't expect to even be interested in studying the Bible came up and said, we can do this.
Well, it does. It gives everybody in the congregation a place in that Great Commission. They're not all going to be teachers,
right,
but it gives everybody a place to where when their time comes, they can stand before their Lord and Savior knowing that they fulfilled the Great Commission.
You're absolutely right. That is a great work. As we mentioned, we are looking at Daniel chapter 6, 16 through 23. Just a brief context. Daniel in the lion's den. Most people are familiar with this biblical account. Daniel was found righteous or found favorable in the sight of King Darius or Darius, however you want to say it. And there was jealousy among the other leaders underneath the king. And so they conned the king into essentially making a law that if anyone worships anyone besides you, they be thrown into the lion's den. And we read as we go, and we'll reference this maybe a couple times as we go. But in verse 10 of this chapter, Daniel continued to do what he'd always done. He would pray in the same place 3 times a day. They knew he would. They knew he was a person of habit. And as a result, the king and the leaders threw him into the lion's den. And that's what we're going to pick up in verse 16. It says, then the king commanded that Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And the stone was brought and laid at the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and the signet of the Lord's, and that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. What do you have there?
Well, I think the first thing that you see is that Daniel's faithfulness had a big influence on this pagan king. I mean, that's a pagan king that's saying, may the God that you continually serve or that you serve continually. So that I think that goes to show us that our faithfulness doesn't just affect us. It affects all of those around us. And so this king, no doubt it was probably somewhat of a hope or a wish. Or, he obviously knew that Daniel had faith in his God. He knew what Daniel's God was able to do, the things that he was able to accomplish. And so we know when we get a little bit later down there, we'll see in a minute that he was restless all night. He was wandering.
Right.
But the fact that Daniel was such a godly, faithful person had certainly influenced this pagan king.
Right. No, that's an excellent point. What I did is I underlined that phrase in verse 9, 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. This is after the edict had been made that you would be punished for it. And I drew a line down to Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And I put this note next to it. I put a matter of life and death. And Daniel was willing to die to continue to speak to God, to pray to God. And then I try and put questions that make me reflect on myself. I put, how do I pray and study? And that's a twofold question. One, if my enemy, if it was going to be punishable by the government to pray and study God's word, would that be something my enemies would use against me the way that his enemies used against him? He was so continual and consistent in it that they knew they could make a law that outlaws it and that they would be able to catch him from a governmental standpoint. And two, am I willing to die for it? If death was the penalty for praying, if death was the penalty for studying, would I be willing to give my life for it? Because Daniel was. I think there we sometimes, because we know the outcome of the story, kind of look at it from the standpoint of Daniel's perspective, like Daniel's going to be okay anyway. But I think when we look at it, where we're at this point, before he's thrown into the lion's den, there's a good possibility that he thought, I'm going to continue to do this, and it's going to cost me my life.
And that's a faith that has to be predetermined. You don't get to the point of a trial and then all of a sudden decide I'm going to have this kind of faith. You've got to have that kind of faith long before, because if you don't, Satan's going to destroy you when those trials come.
Absolutely.
So, some people, it's interesting how people have different responses to trials in this life. Some people draw nearer to God. Some people shrink back away from God. Daniel, his faith and his loyalty was so ingrained in his everyday walk that when this came, it was not even something that he would waver from. He was going to be loyal to God no matter what happened.
I was having a conversation with my buddy, Jeff, who was on the last episode when we talked about Ezekiel, and he made the point, man, poor Ezekiel, during the captivity had a rough life. He was Daniel in a palace and all that. We were making a joke, just, Daniel had it easy, Ezekiel didn't. But you're absolutely right. And I think that's a great lesson for us from that perspective. Even though we're joking, there's still a good perspective from that standpoint, is this determination to go into the lion's den and die for your faith was made during a time of comfort and peace. And exactly like you said, you and I are in a country where we can worship freely, evangelize freely, do it all without any type of harassment from the government. Now is the time to fortify ourselves and make ourselves put ourselves in that position that if that time comes where we're going to have to pay for it, that starts now when it's easy.
And we're so blessed. As bad as people think the United States is, we're so blessed to live where we live. But sometimes it's almost as though that's our downfall, because we don't live like people in North Korea or people in Iran or people in Syria, where their lives are on the line every single day. And so I almost think that sometimes the blessing that we have in living in this part of the world is one of our weaknesses, in that we don't establish that strong faith early on, knowing that it's not always going to be this way.
Right.
So
you're absolutely right. Very good point. I also underline continually, even under the threat of the lion's den, is a note I put next. I also put, may your God, whom you serve, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. I put, may your God, underlined it. And I put, the king was bound by his own law, but God was not. I think that's interesting. This is the most powerful man in the world. This is his law, yet he's not able to deliver.
That's right.
Daniel. It's God who delivers him. And I think the same thing, and we've made this, I think I made it actually on the episode with your brother, that sometimes we look at the government. We need the government to change so that the church can flourish. Well, Hebrews 7 says the lesser blesses the greater. We need the church to flourish so that this nation will flourish. And I think
exactly right.
That's pointed out here. What else you have?
Another thing is that stands out to me in this whole account is that Daniel knew that he would be delivered, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that they would be delivered, but they didn't know how that deliverance was going to come. Right. Maybe that deliverance would come through their death, maybe deliverance. They didn't know, but it didn't affect their faith. It didn't affect the outcome of how they behaved themselves or how they, their dedication to Christ or to God, rather. It didn't affect any of that. They were going to be loyal to God regardless of what the outcome. And then however God delivered them, well, then it would fall how it may.
Great point. You alluded to it earlier. I underlined that phrase in verse 18, sleep fled from him. And I put these two notes. One, I put, the king had a worse night than Daniel.
Yeah.
King's in a palace, Daniel's in the lion's den, yet the king's the one who had a worse night. The second one I put, it's better to be a child of God in the lion's den than to be a faithless king in the palace. And I think, we look at it from that standpoint. I'd rather be a pauper in the shoes of Lazarus than in the shoes of the rich man in Luke 15. What else do you have before we move on?
You know, we read about the peace that passes all understanding, you know, and but that's really that's what you just said a while ago. You can be in the worst circumstances in life,
Mhm.
but you'll sleep better than this king did if you have, you know, God on your side, if you've got a
Absolutely.
faithful relationship with God. One other thing I just wanted to point out though is what you see there in verse 17, the sealing of the lion's den, the stamping with the signet ring. Is very parallel to what happened with Christ, you know, with the
Yes, sir.
tomb.
No, excellent point. Yeah, and that's a good correlation to draw. All right, verse 19 says, Then at the break of day, the king rose and went in haste to the den of the lions. As he came near to where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. What do you have there?
Well, again, it goes right back to the fact that Daniel knew that he was going to be delivered in one way or the other. So the king, you know, the king obviously had been affected by Daniel's relationship with him, by Daniel's godly influence. And so, you know, the king doesn't, we read that king didn't want him to die in the lion's den.
Right.
But like you said, he couldn't overturn his own law. It had been stamped into law. So he's spending all night long, you know, he's denying entertainment. He can't sleep. You know, he's basically pacing the floor waiting for that morning. And Daniel's a-okay because God's protecting Daniel. And so the king gets there. You can hear the anxiousness in his voice. You know, he didn't know
Right.
what he was going. He knew what he hoped he would find, but he didn't know what he was going to find when he got there. But Daniel cries out to him and says that, you know, my God sent his angel, and it just shows the protection that we have, not from hard times, not from tribulations, not from difficult moments in our life, but the overall protection and insulation that we have by God when we have a relationship with Him.
Excellent point. That's an excellent point. I found it interesting, you know, and it definitely is a nod to the inspiration of the Bible. Daniel wrote this, yet I found it interesting that we're talking about it not from the lion's den perspective, but from the king's perspective. You know,
Right.
we don't know anything outside of Daniel telling the king what happened in the lion's den. So Daniel's in the lion's den, the angel shut his mouth, which you'll see in just a moment. But we're looking at it from the king's perspective, which I think is an interesting way that the Holy Spirit approached this. I highlighted that verse 21. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. The only way, and I uh, tied that phrase, O king, live forever, up to, O Daniel, servant of the living God, in the previous verse. And the only way, only through the living God could this king live forever. And I think what we have here, and I think that's an important verse, though it's short, it's from the standpoint of what's being said here is this was a proof to King Darius about whose God was living and whose God was fake. The kings of Darius would not been able to deliver him. Hebrews 11 verse 6, I also put next to this phrase, where he must believe that God is, and he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.
right.
That's being played out here. And I believe the reason this took place, the reason that Daniel was delivered from the lions was not to spare the life of Daniel, even though that was the reward for his faithfulness. I'm not saying that wasn't it, but I think the primary purpose of this was to show the king of the Medo Persians, the most powerful man in the world, that the living God is able to deliver anybody.
Right.
And you know, and where you were helpless, the living God was not. And I think that's a great, and I think that's why David responds. Daniel responds that way.
It reminds me, it makes my mind go back to like Jonah with Nineveh. You know, you see what happened with Nineveh, and then we know where they were 100 years later.
Right.
But it's almost like that whole account was more for him than it was for them. And it's the same thing we see here. The other thing that I think of when I read this is I think about Peter telling us that we're supposed to, you know, fall under the authority or respect the authority or not rebel against powers, you know, the people that are in power.
Right.
Daniel notes right here, you know, even at the end of that, he says, I was found innocent before him. Also, O king, I've done no wrong before you.
Right.
So Daniel, even though he was in captivity all these years, since he was a young man, all the way up to a very elderly man, he was in captivity all this time, but he still, he never left his loyalty for God. He never let his faithfulness wane to God, but he still respected those that are in power, as long as it didn't conflict with what he had to do with God. then he still respected him. And he was an obedient person, and he was a
Right.
servant to these people. And he says, he acknowledges that I've done no wrong before you, King.
Mhm. No, that's a great point. And I think that's, the way, Nebuchadnezzar and Darius here treat Daniel shows that he didn't have a conflict. He rebelled.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's interesting. He rebelled against the king's
Mhm.
law by praying 3 times. Yet it's the king's that's worried about his well-being, not the law
That's
that he
right.
set.
That's right.
And that's a testament to the character of Daniel. So I do, as often as possible, as Romans 12, live peaceably with all men.
Amen.
And then God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Our responsibility is to try and get along with everyone that we can.
Yeah.
And I think I think it's possible, and I've said this before, but I think it's possible to evangelize, to warn people of a eternal torment that they're heading towards if they don't obey what the gospel call says to do. But I think it's possible to do it lovingly. I
Right.
think it's possible for them to look at us and at least have respect for how we delivered the warning. Unfortunately, I think some people enjoy telling people that they're wrong, whereas I think we should take an example from Daniel's character here.
Well, we saw that just a few decades ago, where in the church that what we refer to as the turn or burn attitude, where that way
Right.
of teaching, it wasn't an effective way of teaching, and I've known people personally that I've tried to evangelize or I've tried to study with, but they were affected in such a negative manner when they were young by that turn or burn attitude, and it's we're doing the same thing, but we're doing it with love, and we're doing it
Right.
with compassion. And that's the way that we're effective on those around us that are lost.
You're absolutely right. My wife, very wise woman, always says, meet people where they are and meet them
Amen,
with
yeah.
love. And so, excellent point. We'll move on. Verse 22. It says, my God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. What do you have there?
Well, just going back to the same thing we've been talking about. One, that Daniel was fine, because it doesn't matter what's going on in your life, or it doesn't matter what kind of things you're going through. If your trust is in God and you have we say relationship with God, a scriptural relationship with God, then God's going to take care of you. He's never going to let you down. God doesn't set us up for failure. He doesn't, he's not trying to hurt us, or everything good comes from God. He's wanting the very best. And, the commands and the rules and the laws that he set forth for us, they're for our benefit.
Right.
They're to keep us safe, spiritually safe.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's excellent. I underline that phrase. So I underline that phrase in verse 22. I was found blameless before him, and then draw a line down to that and underline that phrase in verse 23, because he had trusted in his God.
Mhm.
And I think that's there. Some people argue that Daniel said, I was found blameless, and that's why he's delivered. And then a commentator would say, well, no, he's actually delivered because he trusted in God. I think these are synonymous terms.
Yeah,
If
I
you
agree.
trust in God the way that you should, you're going to be found
Exactly.
blameless. So those are two links. And I put this note next to those statements. I put irony. The same faith that sent Daniel to the lion's den was the same faith that delivered him from the lion's den.
That's right. That's a great
and
point.
that's an excellent thought. I also put 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12 from a application standpoint. I know whom I have believed in, and persuaded that he is able to deliver me against all I've committed in that day. And that's the point Paul's making.
Mhm.
I am trusting that I will be found blameless before God, because that's what God has said. God's trustworthy. The immutability of God, to me, is one of the most underappreciated facets of his character. And all of them are great, but the fact that the same God that delivered Daniel is the same God that will deliver us, and he will do it for the same reason.
Isn't that amazing?
It's
It's amazing.
wonderful. So
It's I think sometimes where we get ourselves in trouble is we're too apt to compare ourselves to other people. What are they going through? What's going on in their life, and what's going on in my life? And we have to remember, we're not all we're all walking the same walk, but our experiences are going to be different. Some people's going to be very, very difficult. I hope and pray that I'm never thrown into prison,
Right.
especially multiple times, like many of the apostles were. Their walk was very different. Their experiences were very different. but we're going to get the same reward. I mean, Jesus kind of alludes to this in Matthew chapter 20, you know, when he's talking about the guys going out into the vineyard, you know, and working at different hours of the day. We're going to have different experiences, but the reward's going to be the same. And we don't want to look at somebody and think, well, why should they have the comfort and the peace and the
Right.
protection when they haven't had it as rough as I have? Because I guarantee you, we haven't had it as rough as Paul has. We haven't gone through the things Daniel went through, or the things that, you know, many of the people we read about in the scriptures.
No, that's an excellent point. I think there's, and I don't think any Christian has had it easy. But I think in comparison, you and I have never, if you were to take the proverbial scale of what Jesus gave for our salvation and what he requires of us for our salvation, you know,
Doesn't even move the scale.
We wouldn't even, I think we'd be ashamed of how we maybe at times complain about some of the things that take place to us. Also, you probably noticed in verse 22, he sent his angel. If you have a reference Bible, you probably have Daniel 3 and verse 28. But if you don't, put that next to it.
Nebuchadnezzar.
That's when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar looks down and sees one like the Son of Man, an angel in there with him, protecting him. And then we see again here in the lion's den, the angels there. Now there are those, and I would tend to lean this way, that these are the second member of the Godhead, the pre-incarnate Word.
Yep, I agree.
And so I think what's interesting about this is, even though it's from the king's perspective, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den by himself, but he wasn't alone. Go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus went ways, his disciples fall asleep, but he wasn't alone in the garden. You know, God was with him. God was with Daniel here. God was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you go to Hebrews 13:5, I will never leave you nor forsake you. You and I have never been in the lion's den, but if we do find ourselves there at some point, we're not alone.
We're not alone.
He won't forsake you in the den. He won't forsake you in the palace, as long as we are, you know, found blameless or
Well,
trustworthy.
Jesus told the disciples into John 16, right before he moves into that prayer in John chapter 17, you know, you guys are all going to leave me, but the Father's never going to leave me. I think that's why we see, you know, Jesus saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me on the cross? He's referencing back to Psalm 22, you know, where David felt like for the first half of that chapter that he was alone, but then was able to see at the end that no, God had been right there with him all the time.
Excellent point. No, you're absolutely right. And it's reassuring. I mean, it's just, you go to the things, you know, you look at, and the prophets are great. We just recorded an episode with Aaron earlier on the minor prophets, and we made the point that a lot of the prophets you can put against the landscape of the world today and just see that everything's cyclical.
Yeah.
But there's also we often associate a negative connotation with the prophets, because that was essentially their purpose, was to go warn the people. And so we look at them negative. But the reality is when we really step back, they're comforting. We could read the prophets in times of hardship the same way that we read the Psalms and Proverbs, in the sense of finding comfort. Now, it may look a little different. I know when my dad passed away, I kept going to Job 38 through 42, or 38 through 41, where he's just asking question, where were you when this happened? And that's where I found comfort. It wasn't 23rd Psalm, even though that is a comforting psalm. It was the realization that God's in control.
Right.
And I think the prophets do the same thing. We can go to them for comfort, not from the standpoint of, hey, flowers and unicorns and rainbows or anything like that, but from the standpoint of, hey, other people suffered, but they still remain loyal to God, and he still delivered them.
Right.
That's where we could find it.
That's
what else
where
you
we
have
find the
before we
comfort.
close?
And the other thing is too, when we look at this, it doesn't matter anywhere in this Bible, we have to look at it through the lens of the time that it was being written. Obviously,
Absolutely.
there's application for us. That's the reason it's been recorded for us. But we first need to go look at it through the lens of their time and what was going on in their lives and how were they comforted by this and what were they dealing with. Then we can make proper application to ourselves.
Great
But
point.
if we just take it and try to read it and apply it to ourselves, we miss the bulk of the message.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. Daniel, remember, taken in the first captivity, removed from home. And I think that's interesting as well, from the standpoint of Daniel was still faithful to God, even though he was hundreds of miles away from the temple, from his home, and from where he had
And Daniel was
practiced.
probably fairly young at that time. You know,
Oh,
I mean,
very, absolutely.
you can imagine us, and in our teens or late teens or early 20s along in there, just being ripped from everything and taken into captivity.
You're right.
That would be a traumatic event.
You're
Yet he
right.
remained faithful from day one.
I agree. That's a great point. I try and communicate to my kids. One, and I don't want to seem bleak or dark, but like you mentioned earlier, there will be a day where worshiping God will not be as easy as it is today. I don't know when that day will be here. It might be during our time. It might be during the time of our children or our grandchildren or great grandchildren. But I always try and communicate to my children, one, to remain faithful, obviously, but B, don't be scared to move or go where you
Right.
can worship God. You mentioned Paul also says to pray for the leaders of the country that you may live a life peaceful and godly. And I think that's the reason we're to pray for our leaders. Utmost reason, not for the taxes, not for foreign affairs, not for immigration, even though those can be important issues. But ultimately, we want our government to succeed so that you and I can do what we're commanded to do by God in a peaceful situation. That's ultimately what should be the purpose of our prayer for this country. You have anything else?
I'd just like to, finish up by saying, just kind of on that, we're supposed to let our light shine, right? Well, our light doesn't shine very bright if we're in an area where there's a whole lot of light. We need to go. Sometimes we got to pick up and go to a dark place so that our light can shine.
Right.
I was reading a minister down in Florida had talked to a friend of his that's a minister in California, and he said, "How in the world do you stay in California as bad as it is?" And he said, "Because if I leave, who's going to stay here? Who's going to share the gospel?" Sometimes we need to realize that we're in the situations we're in because God can use us in those situations, and so we shouldn't be so quick to complain about the job that we have or the town that we live in or the school that we go to, because there's work to be done there and God can use us in that work.
You're absolutely right. No, that's a great point. And Daniel capitalized on that. Would he have preferred to be in Jerusalem in the temple and where he should have, originally had been? Probably so. But what he took the circumstance that he was in, and he eventually, for lack of a better term, evangelized to a king.
Yeah.
To the most powerful man in the world. And he did it on multiple occasions. Nebuchadnezzar here.
Put you in mind of Paul when he's in chains in Rome and he's still preaching. He's still whatever situation he finds himself in.
Great point. Great point. Also a testament that God's word is for all, rich, poor, young, old, whoever it is. Keno, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thank you for having me. I
It's
appreciate
been a
it.
great study. To those who are listening and watching, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for liking, sharing, and spreading the news or the word about this podcast. Big thanks to everyone else who supports it. And with that, we are out.
Now, if you mark in your Bibles, underline that.